I wasn't supposed to be gone that long. Just 10 days. 10 days in the mountains to finally breathe after a year of medical hell. 2 surgeries, 3 ER visits, and a cocktail of medications that barely kept the pain in check. But the moment I pulled into my neighborhood, engine humming with the promise of normalcy, I knew something was wrong. The first thing that hit me was the blockade. A row of metal barriers lined the entrance to my cul-de-sac like some kind of war zone checkpoint. Not construction cones, not caution tape, actual metal barricades, the kind you'd see at protests. A faded white pickup truck with a magnetic HOA security sign sat diagonally across the road, and a smug guy in wraparound sunglasses stepped in front of my car, hand up like he had a badge. "This road's closed to through traffic," he said without looking at me, as if reciting a script. I rolled down my window and tried to stay calm. "I live here, that's my house, right there, number 312. His eyes finally met mine. "Name: Taylor Morris." He tapped something on his phone, frowned, then shrugged. "You'll have to talk to the HOA president. No one told me about you." "I'm literally on the deed," I said, voice tightening. "I've lived here for 9 years." He took a step back and leaned against the hood of his truck. "Look, I just follow orders. President McKinley said this section's off-limits until further notice." President McKinley. A name that curdled in my stomach like spoiled milk. Claire McKinley had been elected HOA president 6 months ago in one of the sketchiest votes I'd ever witnessed. Half the ballots were proxy votes, some supposedly signed by residents who'd moved away, some by elderly neighbors who later told me they didn't remember voting at all. But she won, and within weeks she'd turned our once chill neighborhood into her personal HOA kingdom. Fines tripled. Lawn inspections happened weekly. A single dandelion could earn you a $100 citation. I drove around the barricade when he turned away to take a phone call. He didn't chase me, probably thought I was bluffing. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what I saw next. My garage was gone. Not damaged, not under construction. Gone. Where it once stood, there was a flat patch of dirt and broken concrete, like a scar carved into the earth. Debris was still scattered, shards of siding, splintered beams, twisted rebar. My custom tool wall, the one I'd spent 3 years organizing, was half buried under what looked like the remains of my roof. And taped to my front door, fluttering in the breeze like some sick parody of a welcome sign, was a notice. Unauthorized structure removed, violation of architectural guidelines, HOA Code 7.2b. I stood there frozen, my keys dangling from my fingers, staring at the words until they blurred. I didn't know whether to scream or collapse. Instead, I pulled out my phone. Because before I'd left, I'd installed a set of motion-detecting cameras, cheap ones, sure, but functional. One above the front door, one on the garage, one inside the garage, and one behind the house that captured the alleyway and back fence. I hadn't told anyone about them, not even my neighbor Jacob, the only person on this street I halfway trusted. The cameras uploaded everything to the cloud, 10 days of footage. My hand trembled as I opened the app and started scrolling. It started 3 days after I left. 2 men in neon vests walked around my property, pointing and gesturing. Claire McKinley followed them with a clipboard, a permanent sneer carved into her face like she'd practiced it in the mirror. She didn't knock, didn't leave a note, just circled my house like a buzzard. Day 5, a backhoe rolled in before dawn. A crew of 4 started hammering and sawing. No permits were visible, no notices posted, just demolition. By noon, my garage was crumbling. Day 6, Claire stood in the debris, talking to someone on speakerphone. I couldn't hear the audio, but her expression said enough. She was pleased. Day 7, a truck dumped gravel on the road in front of my house. Then more barricades. Then the white HOA security truck. I watched in sick disbelief as Claire handed out armbands to volunteers. By day 8, they'd closed off the entire cul-de-sac, fencing it like a compound. My neighbor Jacob tried to intervene. He argued with one of the volunteers, but Claire waved a clipboard in his face and pointed down the street. He left shaking his head. I stared at my screen, numb. This wasn't negligence, this wasn't a mistake, this was a hit job. And they'd waited until I was gone. But here's the thing, I wasn't just some clueless homeowner. Before the surgeries, before my health fell apart, I was an investigative tech journalist. I knew how to build cases, how to follow the money, how to expose lies. And thanks to those cameras, I had everything. Now they had no idea I was back. Not yet. I pocketed my phone, stepped over the busted concrete, and opened my front door. That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to let this slide. They'd declared war. But they hadn't met the right enemy. The house smelled like sawdust and dust-baked silence. No one had been inside, not that I could see, but there were fresh footprints on my welcome mat. Small ones, Claire, maybe, or one of her little volunteers. I did a sweep, adrenaline keeping me alert as I checked every room, each closet, under every bed. Everything looked untouched, but I noticed something odd in the living room. The sliding glass door was unlocked. I never left it unlocked. I snapped photos of the latch and the footprints before closing it. Documentation mattered now. Everything I did from this point forward would be recorded, cataloged, time-stamped. Claire wanted a war. I'd bring her the full legal siege. I spent the next 2 hours backing up all my camera footage to 3 separate drives, 1 physical, 2 encrypted cloud accounts. While they uploaded, I cracked open my old press contacts list and started drafting emails. No headlines yet, just feelers, a few quick summaries, nothing flashy. Yet, by the time I finished, my phone was vibrating with notifications from my motion cameras. Someone was back. I peeked out through the blinds. Claire herself was pacing the sidewalk in front of my house, flanked by 2 HOA board members I barely recognized. One was tall and gray-bearded, the other round-bellied with a camo baseball cap and clipboard. They hadn't seen me yet. Claire stopped directly in front of the destroyed garage and raised her phone. I watched her snap photos like she was inspecting a cleanup job, then nod toward the guy with the clipboard. He scribbled something and pointed at my driveway. I cracked the window. Needs to be hauled out by Friday, clipboard guy was saying. Claire didn't lower her voice. If they contest it, we'll cite the noise ordinance. No construction without pre-approval. They'll think twice before trying anything again. Something about the way she said they made me bristle. She didn't think I was home, that much was clear. Perfect. I waited until they moved on to the next house, an elderly couple who rarely left their porch, and slipped out the back door, circling the block until I reached Jacob's place. I tapped on his screen door twice, then again. He opened it before the third knock. Taylor, he blinked like he didn't believe it. Holy hell, you're back, did you see? They destroyed my garage. His jaw tightened. I tried to stop them, I swear. I called the city code enforcement, even tried to file a police report, but Claire had her paperwork ready, told everyone you'd already been cited and ignored the warnings, that it was a safety hazard. I never got any citations. He looked around, then stepped outside and closed the door gently behind him. Of course you didn't. I think she's been intercepting mail. The carrier quit last month and she pushed the board to appoint her niece to take over delivery. Ever since then, stuff been going missing. Notices, ballots, even packages. That explained the missing garden equipment I'd ordered back in February. I thought it had been porch thieves, but this was more organized. She's closing in on something, Jacob muttered. She's been cracking down on everyone. Sandra got fined $500 for having wind chimes that made noise during a storm. The Hernandezes got hit for excessive leaf accumulation. She's targeting people who don't fall in line. And the ones she can't bully, I added, she pushes out. I didn't say it, but we were both thinking the same thing. The cul-de-sac was diversifying. Younger families, working-class homeowners, a few retirees who didn't match Claire's cookie-cutter image of suburban perfection. She wanted control, and now I had proof of how far she was willing to go to keep it. I need your help, I said, not just to file a complaint. I'm talking full-scale exposure. Jacob stared at me. What kind of help? Drone footage, witness statements, testimonies, digital forensics. I want to make it so airtight that when the story drops, it scorches the HOA down to the foundation. He exhaled slowly. You're serious. She demolished my property without a permit and blocked a public road. I'm beyond serious. Jacob hesitated only a second. Then let's do it. Over the next 2 days, we built a war room. We turned his garage into a command center, laid out my backups, synced all the video feeds, and started creating a timeline. We found the missing permit office filing. It had been falsified. The date had been backdated by a week and signed off by someone who didn't even work for the HOA anymore. Jacob tracked it down through the board's shared drive, which Claire had idiotically kept open to anyone with a login. He'd been on the board for a month before resigning in protest, and his credentials still worked. We also found emails, hundreds of them. Claire to the board, Claire to private contractors, Claire referring to residents as risks, outliers, and more than once undesirables. Jacob pulled up a folder labeled TRNSITONS and clicked open a spreadsheet. Names of residents, move-out dates, fines issued, followed by one column labeled target score. Most had numbers beside them. I was a 10. By day 3, we had a list of 14 homes that had received citations under questionable pretenses. 5 of them had sold in the past 6 months. 4 were pending. That's nearly half the cul-de-sac. It was a purge. Then something shifted. We noticed the surveillance. A new set of cameras had been installed on the HOA poles. Cameras that weren't there when I left. Cameras pointed directly at certain homes, mine included. No signs, no warnings, just silent black-eyed lenses watching us. And then the unmarked car started showing up at night. Same time, same spot, parked a few doors down with lights off. Claire knew something. We worked faster. I reached out to a contact at the Sentinel, an investigative publication known for shining a light on local corruption. I sent them a package, a redacted version of the video timeline, a copy of the forged permit, and a brief summary of what had happened. Within 6 hours, I had a callback. "This is insane," the reporter said, "like HOA gone dictator insane. Can you run with it? We need a few more statements to make it watertight, but yes, this will make waves." We were almost there. And then Jacob didn't show up the next morning. His phone went straight to voicemail. His car was gone. His garage was wide open, equipment missing, papers scattered. I found a single piece of paper pinned to his door with painter's tape. Violation notice, unauthorized use of private property, HOA Code 11.4a, immediate action required. I knew exactly what had happened. Claire had found out. And now she was coming for me next. The notice on Jacob's door was a warning, thinly veiled, passive-aggressive, soaked in threat. But what chilled me more than the words was what was missing. Jacob. No note, no text, not even a whisper from any neighbor about where he might have gone. His garage had been stripped of our war room overnight. Our drives, our printouts, our entire case in progress gone. I stood there staring at the taped notice, fists clenched, pulse hammering in my ears. Claire didn't just find out. She struck. And she struck fast. I bolted back to my place, double-checking every lock, then sprinted upstairs to where I'd stashed the backup drive in a hollowed-out vent. Still there, thank God. I connected it to my laptop and checked the files. Everything was intact. Every clip, every email, every doc. She hadn't won yet. But now it was a countdown. I messaged Jacob, then his sister, then 2 neighbors I knew had his number. Nothing. I wasn't naive. I'd seen how power works when it goes unchecked. How people get threatened, bought out, silenced. I just never expected it to play out in a cul-de-sac lined with cherry blossom trees and beige vinyl siding. By noon, Claire had called an emergency board meeting. The notice was delivered by a smug teen with an HOA-branded clipboard. Meeting to address unauthorized surveillance and harassment by a resident, it read. 6 p.m., Community Clubhouse. Mandatory attendance for all residents of Westridge Hollow Phase 2. My section. The section she'd locked down, harassed, and bulldozed into submission. Mandatory my ass, but I was going. Not as a resident. As a witness. As the one person with the footage. I dressed like I used to for interviews, sharp but calm. Button-down shirt, low-key slacks, neutral colors, just enough polish to make it clear I wasn't rattled. And before I left, I sent the full backup to the Sentinel reporter with a simple note. They've started retaliating. If I don't check in by 10 p.m., publish everything. The clubhouse had been redecorated. Claire must have done it herself. The usual worn couches had been replaced with a podium, an American flag in the corner, and a huge laminated banner above the fireplace that read, "Restoring order, a safer, cleaner, stronger Westridge Hollow." There were folding chairs set up in rows, most of them filled by people who looked confused, annoyed, or half asleep, but some wore those HOA armbands, volunteers, enforcers, whatever Claire called them now. I saw Jacob's seat. Empty. Claire took the podium with the fake smile of someone used to giving speeches to people who can't talk back. Her red blazer gleamed under the overhead lights. The board sat behind her in a row like backup singers. We've had a concerning rise in unauthorized surveillance and escalating hostility toward this board, she began. One resident has taken it upon themselves to distribute misleading footage, harass our maintenance teams, and record others without consent. This behavior is unacceptable. Murmurs, a few turned to look at me. I didn't flinch. Claire continued. We are therefore proposing an emergency motion to revoke that residents' HOA privileges, suspend their voting rights, and file an official nuisance claim with the city. She was trying to disappear me. I raised my hand. Claire's smile flickered. This is not an open forum. This affects me directly. I have a right to speak. A few neighbors nodded. One even said, let them talk. Claire's jaw ticked. Fine, 2 minutes. I stepped forward, held up a flash drive. This contains video evidence of the demolition of my property, unauthorized use of contractors, falsified permits, and a pattern of targeted harassment by this board. I have sent copies to legal counsel and to the Sentinel newspaper. If you continue this action, you're not silencing me, you're incriminating yourselves. Claire opened her mouth, but I spoke louder. Where is Jacob Price? That silenced the room. Where is he? I repeated. His garage was raided, our files were taken. He's missing and no one's heard from him in 24 hours. If the board had nothing to do with that, you'd be calling the police. Claire looked genuinely stunned for a moment. Then her eyes narrowed. You don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Price was in violation of several HOA ordinances, and he voluntarily agreed to vacate his premises while we reviewed his file. A blatant lie. You expect us to believe he just walked out and left everything. He was being evicted, she snapped. Gasps, actual gasps this time. On what grounds? Someone asked from the back. Claire paused just a second too long. Safety violations. The crowd wasn't buying it. I saw the shift, subtle but clear, people sitting up straighter, eyebrows raised, doubts spreading like cracks in concrete. Time to hit harder. Safety violations, I repeated. Like these. I pulled up the footage on my phone and mirrored it to the projector at the back of the room, when I'd hacked into via Bluetooth when I first arrived. The screen lit up with crystal clear footage, the backhoe, the demolition crew, Claire pointing with her clipboard, laughing as my garage crumbled behind her. Gasps turned to outcry. That's illegal. You never told us about that. She said it was condemned. I was gone for surgery, I said into the mic. There was no warning, no inspection, no due process, and they've been surveilling residents ever since. Claire lunged for the projector cord and yanked it. The screen went black. Too late. The truth was out. People were standing now, some shouting. The board looked like they'd just been hit by a wave. One guy stood up and yelled, "You cited my wife for unapproved fencing and then sold our fine to collections. Was that part of your transition list too?" Claire slammed her gavel, red-faced. This meeting is adjourned. I said this is adjourned. I walked out to a roar of arguments and angry voices. Neighbors followed me. They asked questions. They offered help. One woman, a retired nurse who'd been fined for excessive yard decor, grabbed my hand and whispered, "Get them, sweetheart." I didn't sleep that night. Neither did the neighborhood. By morning, Claire's truck had vanished from her driveway. But the retaliation hadn't stopped. My mailbox was ripped out. My tires were slashed. A city citation showed up on my windshield, supposedly for illegal residential modifications. The HOA wasn't even pretending anymore. They were trying to bury me before I could bury them. What they didn't realize is that the story had already gone live. At 9:06 a.m., the Sentinel published a full expose. The headline reads, "Demolished and Deceived, How an HOA Turned a Neighborhood into a Surveillance State." Photos, documents, video stills, testimonies. And a final line that made my breath catch in my throat. Sources say one former board member, Jacob Price, is now under protective legal counsel after receiving threats related to the investigation. He was safe. He was fighting too. And now the entire city knew. But the board wasn't finished. They had one last play. And I had one last card to burn. 2 nights after the Sentinel story went live, my street transformed from a pressure cooker into a war front. I don't mean in the dramatic sense, I mean actual physical tension. People stopped waving. Groups gathered in driveways late into the night. I saw a man in his 70s unholster a phone every time a car passed his house. The HOA board was unraveling. But like any animal cornered, they got meaner. Claire hadn't been seen since the story dropped, but her influence lingered like smoke. Citations began appearing overnight on dozens of doors, not taped, nailed in some cases. They hit everything: out-of-regulation porch furniture, unsanctioned solar lights, non-neutral paint hues. One man's car was towed while he ate dinner, accused of violating a rule about excessive street presence. People tried to call the HOA office. The number had been disconnected. Their website vanished, replaced with a white screen and a single message, "Site under maintenance, thank you for your patience." But we weren't patient anymore. Not after we'd seen the records. Not after we realized the entire board had been exploiting HOA funds to pay private security, hand-picked contractors, and even paychecks to Claire's family for consulting and beautification audits. That part came out in the second article. My contact at the Sentinel wasn't just hungry for drama, he was thorough. He dug into tax filings, contractor bids, banking records that we flagged in emails. Claire had funneled nearly $94,000 in community funds into what amounted to a personal vendetta budget. The only thing she didn't count on: us organizing. It started with a block meeting in my front yard, not the clubhouse, not a Zoom call, old school face-to-face. We spread out lawn chairs and handed out printed pages, evidence summaries, contact info for legal aid, templates for formal complaints. Jacob even joined via speakerphone, his voice quiet but steady. "They'll try to stall," he warned. "They'll claim emergency powers, chain of command confusion, whatever they can. Don't stop pushing. Once the city gets involved, they'll turn on each other. You just have to be louder." We took his advice. Within 48 hours, we had filed 17 formal complaints with the Department of Consumer Protection. 8 more went to the state HOA Oversight Council. A local civil rights lawyer agreed to represent us pro bono. He'd grown up in the area and was livid after reading about the surveillance. One resident, Amir, a disabled veteran, had been fined $700 for an unsanctioned ramp. The board called it aesthetic interference. He'd been too tired, too fed up to fight it. Now he was furious. We gave him a platform. He gave us a voice. He went on record, gave interviews, even stood in front of the community with tears in his eyes and said, "She called my ramp an eyesore. I call it my independence." That clip made it onto the local news. Claire didn't respond. The board issued a vague, watery statement blaming overzealous enforcement and administrative confusion. But the footage I had showed otherwise. It showed intent. So I played my last card. I called a special meeting our meeting. I knew from the bylaws that any resident could call one with enough signatures. We had plenty. We used the community park pavilion. No podiums, no laminated slogans, just people. And a projector. I played the video I'd been saving. The one from 2 weeks before they destroyed my garage. Claire in a closed meeting with 3 board members. She thought the camera in the back room wasn't recording. It was. In the video, she laid out her plan to reclaim the cul-de-sac for a higher class of buyer. Her exact words. She bragged about the fines, the fake citations, the way they manipulated older residents into proxy votes. She named people she wanted flushed out, said they were drags on resale value. When it ended, no one clapped. No one spoke. People just stood there, stunned. Finally, someone in the back said, "Let's vote." It took all of 15 minutes. Paper ballots, verified signatures, 2 neighbors designated to count them. We recalled the entire board. Legally. On record. Enforcement would take time, weeks, maybe months, but the foundation cracked that night, permanently. The following morning, city code inspectors rolled in like a convoy. Bright vests, clipboards, official stickers slapped across the HOA office doors. Someone from the DA's office showed up by noon. The neighborhood buzzed with murmurs of subpoenas, audits, even potential criminal charges. Claire's house still dark. But not for long. Because 2 days later, she made one last move. She filed a lawsuit. Defamation, harassment, interference with contractual obligations. She named me, Jacob, the Sentinel, and the residents who voted in the recall. It was a desperate shot across the bow. But she didn't know what we knew. She didn't know about the whistleblower. Turns out one of the board members, clipboard guy, real name Harold Donnelly, had flipped. His name had been tied to 3 fake permits, his signature on 4 forged citations, and when he realized jail time was on the table, he handed over everything. Emails, private chats, meeting minutes, bank statements. Claire's lawsuit was a smokescreen, a distraction. And it was about to backfire hard. Because the moment Harold's testimony hit the city investigator's office, Claire wasn't just corrupt. She was criminal. I showed up to the courthouse that morning wearing the same clothes I'd worn the day Claire destroyed my garage. Not out of superstition, out of spite. That slate gray hoodie and worn jeans had become something of a symbol now. The person she thought she could bulldoze. The risk she calculated into her spreadsheet and marked with a big red 10. I walked into the packed courtroom chin high, and she was there. Claire McKinley sat at the defendant's table, flanked by two lawyers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Her face, once permanently fixed in that smug, tight-lipped smile, was drained of all color. She wore a stiff blazer that didn't quite hide how she was shaking. Across the aisle sat Harold Donnelly, the clipboard man turned state witness. He didn't look smug either. He looked tired, but he nodded at me once, quietly, regretfully, maybe both. This wasn't a civil hearing. The civil lawsuits would come later. This was a criminal arraignment. The charges: fraud, forgery, illegal surveillance, destruction of private property, conspiracy to defraud, misappropriation of funds, and obstruction of justice. 7 charges. More pendings. The courtroom buzzed like a hive, local reporters shoulder to shoulder in the back rows. At least 2 neighbors I recognized from the old HOA meetings sat behind me, their eyes wide. They knew it now. This wasn't just a bad president. This was organized corruption. And I had lit the fuse. When the judge read the charges aloud, Claire didn't even look up. Her hands clutched the table like she was bracing for impact. She pleaded not guilty, of course. Her attorney tried to spin it all as overzealous administration and a breakdown of procedural oversight. But the evidence spoke louder. Harold's testimony confirmed what we suspected and more. Claire had created a shadow committee, an off-the-books task force of loyalists, many of them not even official board members. She promised them discounted dues, influence, even shares in upcoming property redevelopments if they helped her drive out the problem homeowners. She created fake citations using an HOA template, downloaded off a website for $29.99. She hired unlicensed contractors through her brother-in-law's firm. She destroyed my garage with a forged demolition order, one that listed my address and cited a non-existent fire risk. She rerouted HOA mail to a PO box registered under an alias, C.M. Hollowman. The kicker: she submitted a rezoning application to the city 3 weeks before the first code violations started popping up. Her plan was to turn the cul-de-sac into a controlled-access micro-community, with higher dues, stricter rules, and fewer of us. The judge didn't buy a single excuse. Bail was denied. Claire's mouth fell open in shock when the gavel came down. The courtroom erupted, but I didn't cheer. I just exhaled, slow, heavy, like I'd been holding my breath for months. Justice didn't erase what she'd done. But it was the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. The old HOA board was dismantled, stripped of authority pending a full audit. A city-appointed trustee stepped in to oversee operations. We formed a new interim committee, diverse, transparent, with actual community votes. No proxies, no closed meetings. We held barbecues again. Kids played in the street. Neighbors I'd never spoken to waved from porches. For the first time in years, people looked out their windows with curiosity, not fear. Jacob returned. He moved back into his house like nothing had happened, though his step was lighter. I caught him on his porch one morning, coffee in hand, watching as Amir, the veteran, installed a new ramp with the help of 3 volunteers and a hardware store donation. Jacob raised his cup to me and said, "Told you, all it takes is louder voices." We smiled. But it wasn't over. Claire tried to sue me again from jail, a pathetic last gasp. My lawyer filed a motion to dismiss that same week. Her case was thrown out before it even made it to hearing. The Sentinel ran a follow-up feature, this time about community resilience. They included pictures of the rebuilt garage, the mural kids painted on the side with my permission, and the new sign that now stood at the entrance of our street. Westridge Hollow Community First, no exceptions. I still kept the flash drives in a fireproof box. Not out of fear. Out of remembrance. Because this wasn't just about a garage, or a ramp, or even the votes. It was about who gets to decide what a neighborhood looks like. Who belongs. And who gets erased in the name of property values. Claire McKinley tried to silence me while I was down, thought I was too sick, too tired, too small to fight back. She didn't know I had a camera. She didn't know I had a voice. And now everyone knows what happens when you weaponize power in the shadows. Eventually, someone hits record.